Hey there, you guys. Great to see you, and a very warm welcome to the Holy Shed. Speaking of which, I've got to say this. It may be still quite chilly here in London, but I'm loving the sunshine and the blue skies. Helps to take your mind off certain other things going on in the world, don't you think? Well, that and the sound of birds managing to sing above the traffic, and of course, the constant presence of my beloved. These are a few of my favourite things that help to feed my high level need for cheerfulness. So, as you are well aware, we're doing a series of sessions in the Holy Shed entitled 30 Years and Counting, casting an eye over my first book, The Post-Evangelical, which has a big birthday coming up this year. In August, it will be 30 years old. And so we're looking at some of the themes in the book through the lens of both then and now. Today, we're going to be focusing on chapter 5 that I called Woolly Liberals with a question mark. You know, for as long as I can remember, the standard response by evangelicals to someone questioning the orthodoxies of evangelical faith is to invoke the bogeyman of liberalism, to warn us against this perceived archenemy of the gospel and how we have to keep away from that at all cost. Don't find yourself on the slippery slopes to liberalism. That's the worst thing that could happen. I tell a story in chapter 5 about a popular evangelical preacher I know who was asked by one of the organizers of a certain annual Christian holiday event what he would be talking about in his keynote session that evening. The reply set off all the alarm bells for the organizer. He said, if you start talking like that, people are going to think you've gone liberal, and then you won't be seen as an evangelical anymore, and then your ministry is going to crumble and die. Your doors will close for you. You won't be invited to speak at events like this anymore. Thankfully, the man was probably of a similar cast of mind to myself. He basically said something like, I don't really give a monkey's. And it's true, you know, time and again, I myself have been called a woolly liberal. Actually, in fact, I don't think I've ever really been woolly. I've certainly never been vague or wishy-washy about things that I believe. Liberal may be disagreeable to some, but not woolly, which is why I kind of sometimes wonder how it is that as soon as you stop being a sheep and going along with the herd, you get called woolly. Puzzles me that. Anyway, when I wrote the book, I think I did feel the need to clarify my non-woolliness. Today, I can't say that that's something I'm concerned about at all. If I were writing that chapter today, it would certainly have a different tone and would be rather more forthright. Because if I believed for an instant that God gave a hoot about labels like liberal, evangelical, Catholic, woolly, or even Muslim or Jew, I'd be out of here like a shot, because none of these things are important. None of them say anything about who we are as people, about the way that we live, the way that we treat people, about how faithfully or not we attempt to follow the way of Jesus. Labels are, well, what they say on the tin, labels. People labelled Jesus, of course. They called him a glutton and a drunkard. They called him a Samaritan, which was just about as bad or worse than being liberal back then. They said he had a demon. So, you know, if these are things that people said about Jesus, the labels they stuck on him, well, in the context of our last session about stages of growth, I think you could say that bogeyman tactics are the tactics of fear, intended to persuade or cajole or coerce us into stepping back in line, conforming. But you know, I think any secure organization of whatever stripe can afford to be clear about its own identity or the consensus view within that organization, whilst also affording individuals the freedom to be themselves, make up their own minds, wander and explore, revise and rethink. And who knows, maybe decide that they now freely accept the consensus or not. It's what I call being grown up. But my real point in this chapter is that post-evangelical does not automatically equate with being liberal. At the time, I personally saw myself as not so much a liberal Christian as a postmodern Christian. But before I go down that road, let's try to clarify a thing or two about these terms and about culture. Because, like it or not, cultural influences shape and form the way our faith expresses itself. And culture changes and evolves over time. Early Christianity was influenced, of course, by Judaism, but also increasingly after Jesus died, by Greek culture, by Roman culture, by Gnosticism. I mean, that's just a fact. The Christian faith, incarnates itself within particular cultural settings. And the effect is two-way. Those settings, those cultural settings, influence and help to shape the message, as well as the message has an impact on shaping the culture that it's set in. The world doesn't stay the same. That's a fact. Human culture, the landscape of our social, intellectual, aesthetic, and spiritual environment is something that changes all the time. There'll always be continuities, of course, in human experience, but also discontinuities. The cultural world of the Bible just plainly is not the world that we live in today. I mean, I feel silly for saying that. It's so obvious. There are many continuities, but there are also discontinuities that are not a bad thing, they're a positive thing. They help us to understand the message in a fuller, wider, and more relevant way. Constant change is here to stay, someone said. And I think that's a good thing. I don't want to live in a world that's static, that's fixed, that never changes. And it's not just the fashions and styles that I'm talking about. Meaning changes as well. As my friend Maggie Dawn said, writing about the post-evangelical in a book which is called The Post-Evangelical Debate. There was a whole book written about my book, and she, I think, wrote the best chapter in it. Well, she agreed with me. I'm afraid the book isn't available anymore, but I loved her chapter, which she called You Have to Change to Stay the Same. In other words, in order to remain faithful and in continuity with the originating sources of the Christian faith, the message needs to change and evolve because the interpretative context changes. For example, I'm perfectly sure that there were people in biblical times who were attracted to those of the same sex or gender, what we now call LGBTQ plus people. But being gay absolutely wasn't a thing back then. I believe that most of the so-called clobber texts in the Bible, which are cited to condemn LGBTQ relationships, refer to abusive and deeply unequal relationships, same-gender relationships which are permanent, faithful and stable, what we call marriage, just didn't exist at the time. It wasn't even a possibility. But today, of course, there are millions of such relationships. LGBTQ marriages and families filled with the love and faithfulness and goodness that we aspire to in heterosexual marriages and partnerships. The context has changed. It doesn't matter a monkey's bum whether the Bible explicitly approves of them or not, because they weren't even a thing at the time. The world has changed, but the central core within the whole subject, which is love, that never changes. So that's a continuity, but the forms in which that love is expressed, yeah, of course, they have changed over time. I didn't write the post-evangelical as, just some kind of abstract essay on the subject. It was born out of my own experiences and reflections over a decade and more. But also, it was born out of my pastoral experience of leading Holy Joe's, a church community that for 10 years met in a pub in South London, where predominantly evangelical defectors and dropouts would gather each Tuesday night to try to hammer out what they could or could not now believe, what the Christian faith really was. To give it a grand title, Holy Joe's was a hermeneutical environment. But that's taken a little bit seriously. It was oiled with lots of fun, with plenty of banter, and quite a bit of beer. What became very clear to me through the experience of Holy Joe's was that the old categories of liberal, modernist, evangelical, traditionalist didn't work for the people who were gathering there and lots of others. They simply just didn't apply. We were in a different mode, a different cultural context to the one that produced these tags or these labels. Let me explain. Liberalism emerged from the modern era, when science and critical reason, through huge doubt and questions over the authority of previous theological assumptions, because it was viewing the Bible and the Christian message through the lens of modern science, through critical reason. Always honest in the way that was happening, I think, but sometimes leaving the impression that there was nothing really much left. There was nothing but a human creation, something that was the product of human projection and imagination with little, if any, room for God. So that's happening on the one hand. Many traditionalist evangelical Christians and others, of course, were troubled by all of this and felt the need to defend the gospel against the ravages of modernism or liberalism. And this led in 1910 to the creation of fundamentalism. It's only that old, which amounted to a list of fundamentals that were seen as categorical and indisputable. These were the markers in the sand, things like the infallibility of the Bible, the virgin birth, the atonement and resurrection, etc. And whilst not all evangelicals now choose to call themselves fundamentalist, fundamentalism, which I view more as a mindset than a list of, essentials, fundamentalism, I think, is the basic shape of modern evangelicalism. The kind of people who came to Holy Joe's, and I soon realized that there were hordes and hordes of similar people around the world, found these old battle lines of evangelical and liberal irrelevant, useless, redundant. We were influenced in our thinking by a newer cultural development called postmodernism, hence post-evangelicals. We'll look at this sort of stuff a little bit more in future sessions. But we at Holy Joe's had, absolutely no desire to ditch Christian faith. That wasn't what we were doing there on Tuesday nights in the pub. We identified with a rich Christian tradition stretching back to the early church, but we did choose to look at it critically or questioningly, and we saw no threat from the findings of science and cosmology, from a critical approach to faith and the Bible. It just didn't seem threatening at all. It only added to the conversation. These developments were seen as potential friends, not enemies of the gospel. What we looked for was not an either-or approach to the gospel and contemporary culture. You're either influenced by the gospel or by culture, but rather a synthesis of the two, what I now prefer to call a progressive approach to faith. In Maggie Dawn's chapter in this book, You Have to Change to Stay the Same, she argues that the post-evangelical necessarily implies a shift away from, she insists that it does not necessarily imply a shift away from orthodoxy. Nearly got that the wrong way around. Rather, she says, it demonstrates that to remain in continuity with orthodoxy, we have to come to terms with cultural change in order to find authentic expressions of that faith, and not an expression of the faith from a bygone era that no longer really fits today's world. And she helpfully goes on to underline my point that meaning is not a fixed entity. And she says, if our religious language doesn't change, then far from maintaining continuity, it actually takes us away from the heart of Christian tradition. We end up with something really different. It's a point that I take up in one of my other books, Re-Enchanting Christianity, which was always intended to be the second half of the post-evangelical. And in that book, I speak about tradition not as a fixed set of doctrines, beliefs, or rituals that we, like a parcel, pass on from one to the next. And the idea is to keep it exactly as it was when it was given to you. That's how tradition and orthodoxy is often perceived and seen. Just don't mess with it. You keep it exactly the same. You be true to how it was in the beginning. But Maggie's saying, actually, that's not tradition at all. As I wrote in Re-Enchanted Christianity, it's much more like, tradition's much more like a conversation, a debate, even a healthy argument. Setting down a list of fundamentals or non-negotiable propositions actually brings conversation and debate to an end. There's nothing more to say. There it is. Take it or leave it. You keep true to that, or you're not part of us. You're either in or out. No, instead, I argued for a tradition of shared speech. Okay, there's a whole shared heritage of speech, shared symbols. So the tradition isn't a thing that you keep the same, but rather it's a living community of revelation and dialogue. Tradition isn't a thing, it's a community. It's a conversation within a community. It's a tradition that invites a process of critical questioning rather than trying to keep it out. The questions change and the answers change as time goes on. So tradition is not static and fixed. It's not stuck in pre-modern mindsets and assumptions, but rather it's dynamic and evolving. Tradition not as a final destination that was reached long ago and we just have to reach back and be there, but rather tradition as a living, progressing process, always affirming that there are new things to see and understand, to debate and discuss. Now that is what I call grown-up tradition. So yes, there's a sense of continuity with the past, but now the discontinuity is that this is where we are. And I think living the faith, wrestling with the faith, is a matter of wrestling with those two dimensions. So Wooly liberal? Well, if woolly means vague and uncommitted, then no. But if woolly means unwilling to nail everything down, which is a bit of a mixed metaphor, or if woolly means warm and welcoming toward difference and other perspectives, then yes, I'll take that. Liberal? Well, again, if liberal means anything goes or everything is relative and subject to personal opinion, then no. But if liberal means open to new possibilities, still searching, welcoming, being welcoming toward fresh understandings and knowledge that keep the whole process moving forward, then yes, I would say I am a liberal. The post-evangelical represents a marker on a journey. I recognized that many people were losing faith because the faith on offer was stuck in the past, in pre-modern assumptions and ideas and metaphors that no longer stood up in their experience in the modern world. And I wanted to say, hang on, That's not all there is on offer. There are other interpretations, open-ended discussion that you can contribute to, other possibilities to explore. At the heart of postmodernity is the recognition that no one at all possesses absolute or truly objective truth. That's not possible. What we have are perspectives. There is no neutral place to stand in and be able to say, I'm right, you're wrong. This is true, that's untrue. So there are perspectives, some of which may be more promising, more truthful, more liberating than others. And to me, that's grown-up reality. It may appear much more straightforward and easier to enter a set of, fixed borders for faith. I mean, that's true, that isn't, this is the truth, this isn't. But we all know that's not reality. It's a fool's paradise, especially if we get stuck there. And we're going to talk more about this, more about truth in later sessions. Just one final word is, it's hard to know what's happening in the world at present, right? Or where it's all leading. It's been a very confusing week, a disturbing week. And all I can say, guys, is this is not a time to crumble and hide away within yourself. It's a time to hope, to be defiant, to get out there and shine for all you're worth. I'm not looking for divine intervention, but I do believe passionately in divine interaction. I believe in a God who isn't far away and distant, who doesn't feel what's going on in our world. I believe in a God who is present in the struggle, in the pain and the trouble, luring the world toward better times, better places. And I believe that we can be part of that. We can align ourselves with the intentionality of God. We can be harbingers, agents of a different kingdom. Our efforts may seem small and insignificant, but every defiant act of compassion or peace, every revealing and acting out of divine love in the world counts for something. It makes a difference. It's not a time to retreat, but to be who we are inside, only more so. We may not be big, but we're small, I often say. God's kind of small. Mustard seed kind of small. Remember, it's better to light a candle than to curse the dark. So I'm going to leave it there for this week. We'll be carrying on these themes. But here's a prayer. It's a heretic's prayer. Loving God, help us to be heretics when it comes to integrity, standing true to convictions, resisting the powers of conformity. Yet help us to resist the heresy of acting or speaking from motives other than love, justice, and humility toward our fellows or toward Mother Earth. Help us to be harbingers and agents of a different kingdom, where your will is performed on earth as it is in heaven, where what we do and who we are as persons is considered more important than what we believe. Amen. Well, very quickly, I'm proposing a toast. Oops. If you've got a drink, join me. I propose a toast to the God of small things, to the power of weakness, to hope which is unstoppably defiant. That's life. To life, L'chaim. Thank you so much for being with me today, guys. If you like what I'm doing here in the shed, you can support us. You can buy us a coffee. You just need to follow the link on the screen now, or find it in the bump that is associated with the podcast or whatever. And we deeply appreciate all those of you who support us like this and in other ways too. And I mentioned the podcast there. It is now underway. There's an audio podcast version of The Holy Shed, which is posted on the SoundCloud every Tuesday. So somewhere during the day on Tuesday, by Tuesday evening, it'll be up there. And I will put a link up, a reminder on my Facebook page and on the Holy Shed Facebook page. And I know already I'm getting lots of responses. A lot of people have been listening to it. So it seems to be filling a need, and I'm very pleased for that. So I'm going to finish with a blessing. It's the Serenity Blessing that I wrote for the Holy Shed back at the beginning of lockdown. And here it is on your screens in just a moment with some lovely music from Moby. So have a great week. Keep on being kind to the world around you, kind to yourselves. That's the most prophetic thing that we can do. I said prophetic, not pathetic, by the way, in the situation that we're in right now. We need to stay human in a world that sometimes is quite inhumane. And I'll see you soon. All the best.